My sincerest pleasure to welcome you to our 6th Fulbright Forum of the 2010 program year. You might wonder, this is 2011, how come I call it 2010? We are still in 2010. The program starts about a year later than the fiscal year, so it's still 2010. 2010 program year will ends at the end of this month. Tonight we are joined by 2010 junior researcher Scott Wells as he presents Kicking the Hanmun Habit, the dynamics of language and power of Late-Choson and Korea's long Hanmun hangover. In his presentation, Scott will share insight into the demise of Literary Sinitic and its relationship with the written vernacular from Late-Choson through the colonial period in order to improve our understanding of disintegration, integration of East Asian cosmopolitanism. Scott received his bachelor's from Brigham Young University with a double major in linguistics and Korean. He is currently completing a master's degree in Korean studies at the University of British Columbia and plans to return this fall to begin PhD. Following tonight's presentation and a brief Q&A session, I hope that you will join us for a light reception on the third floor. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming 2010 Fulbright Junior Researcher Scott Wells. Before I introduce him, I would like to introduce a special guest tonight. We have American International Education Administrators from 8 universities in the United States, and they are presented at this forum presentation. Would you please stand up, the 8 IEAs, please? And please welcome them to our forum presentation. And then also, Evan Paul is back. Okay. He was our grantee up until, last 2 months ago?
January.
Yeah. And then he's back for his research. And hope you enjoyed tonight's forum presentation. And then do not miss the reception on the third floor. You will enjoy it. And then we'll be joined by FLTA Fulbright grantees, foreign language teaching assistants. They are in the orientation program right now with the first floor, and they will soon join us. So we have quite a big audience tonight. Thank you very much. Give Scott big hands. Please.
Okay, I'm going to see if this. Can you hear me with this? Is that okay?
Yeah.
No? Someone's shaking their head? No? Eliana? No? Really? I'll turn it. What's the volume on this? Penny?
Is it on?
It's on. You can't hear me? Yes? No? Should I just talk loud? Oh, I should talk loud. Okay. If I look down like this the whole time? Oh, okay. Thank you, Mrs. Hsu, for that kind introduction. I'm actually at the end of my time here. Today is actually, I've only got a week left. I'm here with my wife and daughter. And in a week we'll be, at this time actually, we'll just be boarded the plane and on our way back to Vancouver. So I really want to thank you, Ms. Sheen, for having me here. As some of you may know, me and my wife and daughter have been able to live here in the Fulbright building in the dorm. And it's been a wonderful opportunity. We've been able to interact with many of the staff and faculty here, and it's all been very helpful. So thank you, Mrs. Sheen. Now, I really need to start off with an apology. For those of you who may have seen the announcement for this presentation, for this talk online, and again heard Mrs. Sheen's introduction of my talk, the title that I gave to Ali and that Mrs. Sheen just read and that was put on the announcement It's a little bit misleading. It's not misleading. Yes, it is misleading. This is what my presentation today is going to be is a small portion, a very small portion of what I'm currently writing my master's thesis. And the title of my master's thesis is this: the demotion of Literary Sinitic in the beginnings of Hanmunkwa, 1976 to 1910. And I thought if I put that on as a title to my presentation, I really like the food here when they do these forums. I know that if there are more people, they make more food, and usually go a little bit, more out of their way to make good food. And so I didn't want to pass that opportunity up for food. So I sort of sexied up my title, if you will. Although I do deal with my research broadly defined. I do deal with dynamics of language and power in the Late-Choson dynasty, roughly from 1876 to 1910. But you see this, and to most people, this is going to just be what it is, sort of jargony, gobbledygook, and so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try to explain the title, at least some of the terms in the title. Okay, so we're demoting Literary Sinitic, and there's this beginning of what we're calling Hanmunkwa, and it's looking at the period 1876 to 1910. These next few slides, I'm going to ask that you bear with me. Before I do this, if you look at the handout, this is where it's under the summary. It is essentially a summary of my thesis. Each of these little paragraphs represents sort of a point-by-point summary of my thesis. So if you turn on the back, you see the first full paragraph and the one after that, so the third from the last and the second to the last. It says new ideas about language that arose from what once would have been unconventional contacts with Japan and the West were not of themselves sufficient to brush aside many centuries of tradition. Changing Koreans' language ideology would require institutional changes. New language ideologies began to filter into Korea after 1876, and in 1894 some of these are institutionalized. So, narrowly speaking, about the presentation today, that is the part I'm going to be focusing on. So, of this summary here. Like I said, broadly speaking, I look at this idea of language and power, and what I mean by that is throughout pre-modern Korean history, throughout the period much prior to the Japanese colonial period, Koreans used a writing system, used a written language that was different from their spoken language. And they had always, from the time writing had been introduced into Korea, used what I term literary Sinitic. It's also sometimes called, well, I don't term it that, I use the term that others have coined, literary Sinitic. Often in English we call it classical Chinese. And there are a lot of problems with the term classical Chinese, especially from a linguistics point of view. Chinese itself, to describe a particular language, is it's way too ambiguous, way too general term to really use in a linguistic sense to describe a particular language. I mean, to the layperson, Chinese, we have these big notions that, well, there are types of Chinese. There's Mandarin, or what we call Cantonese, and sure, classical Chinese, I suppose, is a classical form of those, and that's just not the case. So for precision's sake, and being that I approach this from a linguistics perspective, I use the term literary Sinitic. So when you see literary Sinitic tonight, I mean classical Chinese. Now, what is classical Chinese? Some of you may not know what that is. Think Latin in medieval Europe. Okay, classical Chinese, literary Sinitic is a written lingua franca that sort of tied pre-modern East Asia together. Right? And at the end of this, at the end of the pre-modern period, in this transition to modernity in Korea, this cosmopolitan order that was tied together by a common literacy started to fall apart throughout the cosmopolitan order, but I specifically focus on on Korea. It began first really in Japan, spread to Korea, and then eventually occurred in China as well, as China began to vernacularize their written language. And so, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to introduce a few more terms. In 1894, a man named Hwang Hyun, his pen name was Mechun, you see Mechun Yaro here. Hwang Hyun was a Late-Choson dynasty scholar, well-known scholar and poet, and he wrote what's called the Mechun Yaro. Roughly translated would be something like Mechun's unofficial history or unofficial record. It's really his diary, and it's this long document that lasts from roughly the 1860s all the way into the early part of the 20th century. He died, I think, in about 1908, maybe 1910, I'm not exactly sure, but it was this really long diary. He writes sort of what's going on in the center of power where he is working as a bureaucratic scholar. And he says this, in November 1894, he writes, he says, "In the language of our country, we have long called China's writing Jinzeo, and Hunmin Jeongeum we have called Hanmun, with the two together commonly called Jinan." My head's probably swirling already, these terms. Since the year Kabo, it's 1894, those individuals who pursue current trends have greatly accepted Hanmun, calling it Hongmun, and considering Jinzeo, again that's literary Sinitic, to be something foreign, call it Hanmun. Accordingly, the three-character term Hanmun has been coined, and the terms Jinzeo and Hanmun have finally disappeared. These fools, he says, these fools cry out with, I love this, these fools, these crazy, flippant people. These fools cry out with the argument that Hanmun should be scrapped, but the current state of affairs has prevented and restrained this call. Now, let's discuss some of these terms, and then we'll discuss once we have a better idea what the terms mean, maybe we'll go back and see if we can better understand what Hwang Hyun is talking about. So we've discussed literary Sinitic. That's all I have to say about that. There's more I could say about why it's a great term, but just think classical Chinese if you can't remember literary Sinitic. Jinzeo. So what is Jinzeo? So Mechun tells us that that throughout the previous many long years, Koreans had termed literary Sinitic, they termed it Jinzeo. So Jinzeo was the Korean term for literary Sinitic. Jin means true or genuine or authentic. Seo means writing. So there's this idea that it's the genuine article, right? It's the real writing. Okay? Then we have Hanmun. Hwang Hyun mentions Hanmun. He says that we've called what was originally termed Hunmin Jeongeum, we've called Hanmun for many years. Hanmun is the vernacular. It's the written vernacular. Okay, so in roughly 1444, a group of scholars, along with King Sejong, created a written script, a new native script for writing Korean. We all know today as Hangul. Okay, Hangul is a sort of a modernized and reformed version of this early script, but they termed it Hanmun, which literally roughly means just think of it as vernacular writing. That's really what it means. Vernacular writing. Sometimes it's translated in English as vulgar writing, but if you know the root of the word vulgar means just the everyday thing. The everyday, so the same term as vernacular. So it's the vernacular writing. It's termed Hanmun. Now, these two terms, you can see there's this sort of hierarchy in terms. You have sort of the rustic, everyday Hanmun, and you have the authentic, the genuine, the real, the best, Jinzeo. Okay. And he says, okay, so originally we termed these two languages, Hanmun and Jinzeo. Then he says that Jinzeo is dropped in favor of Hanmun. Okay, Hanmun, literally, for those of you who know Korean, will know this is the Korean term used today for literary Sinitic. Han there's the Han and Han Chinese, like the ethnic group Han Chinese, Hanmun, or the Han Dynasty, Hanmun writing. So Jinso, the authentic, real writing, becomes China's writing, okay, in Korean parlance. And Hanmun, the rustic everyday language, becomes Hungmun. Kuk means state or country. Okay, so it's the state language now. It's the language of state. And Koreans still term their language, their spoken language, is still referred to as Kugo. Hungmun is largely dropped out of usage in favor of Hangul, but at the time of Hwang Hyun's writing, Hanmun becomes Hungmun. So this is this real revolution in the way Koreans are thinking about their written language. The two languages they've been using, the two written languages. What was once sort of Jinso, what was once the authentic script, has now become someone else's script. Okay, it's China's. And what was once, the rustic everyday language, just the vernacular written language, is now the language of state. This is a radical reversal in fortunes. Now, at this point in 1894, it's largely a symbolic shift. There's still a lot of, if you look on the ground, the majority of people who are literate are still using largely Literary Sinitic. And lastly, in my title, I talked about hanmunkwa. Hanmunkwa is just the teaching, the course in Hanmun. Okay, so Literary Sinitic used to be as the language of record in pre-modern Korea. Literary Sinitic was at the center of the curriculum, of educational curriculum. You could really say that the entire curriculum was Literary Sinitic itself. It was learning to be able to read texts in Literary Sinitic, and be able to produce texts in Literary Sinitic. That was essentially the focus of pre-modern Korean educational system. And so what happens is there's a relocation during this transition from Literary Sinitic to the vernacular. There's a removal of Literary Sinitic, both conceptually. It's removed from its high status conceptually. It's no longer Jinso, it's now Hanmun, someone else's script. And the relocation of Literary Sinitic up to that slot. It's now the state script. There's also a physical relocation, if you consider the curriculum, the state curriculum. Literary Sinitic is no longer the center of state curriculum. It becomes hanmunkwa. So when you take French class, there's your French textbooks and it's French class and where you're learning the French language, right? Hanmunkwa is essentially that. It's teaching Hanmun. And there's this new apparatus, dictionaries, textbooks that sort of arise to teach to teach Literary Sinitic in this new way. It becomes Literary Sinitic is no longer the center of the curriculum. It is now one subject among a variety of subjects: math, science, all the others, Kugo itself, Hanmun itself. So let's go back now and just reread what Late-Choson had to say. He says, "In the language of our country, we have long called China's writing Jinso, and Hunmin we have called Hanmun, with the two together commonly called Jinho." Now, of course, if you look at the bottom, Hwang Hyun, he was writing in Literary Sinitic. He's been trained in this language. It's been the center of his academic and scholarly life. So that might give you a hint as to why he feels the way he does, or why he comes across the way he does. We have called Hanmun, and Hunmin Jung we have called Hanmun, with the two together commonly called Jin-an. Since the year Kabo, those individuals who pursue current trends have greatly accepted Hanmun, calling it Kunmun, and considering Jinso to be something foreign, call it Hanmun. Accordingly, the three-character term Hanmun has been coined, and the terms Jinso and Hanmun have finally disappeared. These fools cry out with the argument that Hanmun should be scrapped, that the current state of affairs has prevented and restrained this call. And another hint about the change in status of the two languages. You'll notice he says at the beginning that the two languages, when they're talking about them together, they're often referred to as jin-on. Jin first, then on. Okay, so, but you'll notice later on, it says, according to the three-character term, Hanmun, now it's first. Hu, for Hungmun, for the national script. Han, now Literary Sinitic has moved to second place. So there's this conceptual relocation from first to second. And there's also this physical relocation from the center of state-sponsored curriculum to the periphery, really, to one subject among many, and certainly not even the most important of subjects. This occurs, well, let's go through, gone through the terms. Let me give you a little bit of a historical overview. So this process really begins in 1876. In 1876, for those of you who may know anything about Korean history, it's a pretty important year. It's the year that Japan opens up Korea to diplomatic intercourse. They sign a treaty that allows Japan to have a few treaty ports in Korea, and it's these interactions with Japan in this new way. It's modeled on the opening of Korea by Japan was largely modeled on the opening of Japan by the United States, roughly 25, about 15 years previous. And this for Korea is, again, first only symbolic, but it's this radical new way of interacting with its neighbors, specifically its neighbors in East Asia. And this is a precedent for new interactions with Western countries. The treaty with Japan is a precedent for new treaties, first with the United States in 1882, Britain in 1883, Germany also in 1883, and other Western nations, Italy, Russia, France, shortly thereafter. So this is a radical departure for Korea from a Sinocentric worldview, where all of Korea's foreign relations, if you can call them that, were largely funneled through a conduit of China. Korea wasn't necessarily a protectorate or a vassal of China, but it had autonomy within, and its foreign relations, if we can call it that, were largely managed by its relationship to China. So this is a radical departure from that worldview. And in 1876, coincidentally, the term Hanmun is first introduced to Korea in the text of the treaty that was signed between Korea and Japan. In the 1880s, China, the Qing dynasty, begins to assert itself in an imperialistic manner. Largely, they themselves have undergone a certain amount of colonization, but they start to assert themselves in an imperialistic fashion, largely modeled on Western imperialism. And the 1880s are really a period of Chinese imperialism in Korea. And this is important because I mentioned that Hanmun is introduced in this 1876 treaty. In the 1880s, we see Hanmun term used much more frequently in Korea, and the term Jinseo sort of just peters off. And it happens during the 1880s, during this period of Chinese colonialism and imperialism, not colonialism, but imperialism in Korea. 1894 is a watershed event in modern Korean history for a lot of reasons, but as regards to language, in 1894, there's a few things that affect Literary Sinitic in the vernacular. One is very symbolic. It's the beginning. This is where 1894, during a series of reforms called the Kabo reforms. Kabo is the name of the year in the Chinese calendar. During the Kabo reforms, there are a series of proclamations, a series of mandates that state that the vernacular is now the language of state. Again, this is largely symbolic. because Koreans continue and the government continues. People in government, they weren't really literate in a written form of the vernacular. Of course, they'd always spoken, but the concept of the difference between a written and spoken language was such that that they couldn't just simply pick up in writing the vernacular sort of overnight. So this is largely a symbolic proclamation that says that government, what they say essentially is government mandates, government proclamations, laws, and so forth will all be based in the vernacular, in the written vernacular. And attach a Hanmun, you can have a copy of the text for, so make sure people actually understand what you're writing, but they need to be based in the vernacular. This is largely symbolic, like I said, because Koreans continue to use Literary Sinitic primarily for some time still. The event that had the greatest effect on Literary Sinitic's use in Korea during 1894, excuse me, was the abolition of the traditional civil service examination system known as Kwago. What happens is the gateway to success in Korea for if you were high class and you were part of the ruling elite was to study for 12, 13, 14 years. Of course, you'd be studying a curriculum based on Literary Sinitic. You take an examination, a series of examinations, all testing your knowledge of texts that were in Literary Sinitic. You'd be writing in Literary Sinitic, and this is what controlled these examinations. Controlled access to the bureaucracy, and becoming a graduate of these exams and becoming a member of the bureaucracy was seen as sort of the highest level of success in Korea at the time. And so removing what kept Literary Sinitic at the center of the curriculum was preparation for exams that tested you in Literary Sinitic. So getting rid of the exams suddenly sort of undoes, almost overnight, the reasons for learning Literary Sinitic in the first place. So it's replaced by an exam that tests you in your knowledge of world affairs, and science, and geometry, and other math skills. And there is Hanmun is still Literary Sinitic is still a component. Kugo, Korean language is now a component. So this is a major upsetting of the status of Literary Sinitic in Korea. By 1905, the curriculum is completely changed. This is where. So just like I said, the symbolic measures to sort of make Korean, the written vernacular, sort of the language of state in 1894, really institutionalized in 1905 with promulgation. We know that. You may know if you know your Korean history, 1905 was the year that Korea became a protectorate of Japan. So really from 1894 to 1905, this is all largely happening under the auspices of Japanese influence, some of it sort of soft influence. But by 1905, particularly, the influence becomes very hard and very rigid and very direct, very forceful. By 1910, Korea is annexed, and the question of how official institutions are going to deal with Literary Sinitic is sort of out of Koreans' hands. It's now in the hands of the Japanese. So there's this sort of historical overview. Now I'm going to go back and focus on these terms. I think the terms are very important, what they originally meant, how they were used, and it can give us an understanding of how this transition was able to happen. Hanmun, we said, was the original term for vernacular writing. It first appears, if you look at the term I use the Choson Dynasty annals, annals of the Choson Dynasty and a few other sources to sort of search how these terms were used throughout the dynasty. I specifically use the annals because they cover the entire dynasty. Now there are issues with that we can't discuss here. If you'd like to ask a question about it, maybe I can explain a little bit more. But in the annals known as the Shiro, it first appears, Hanmun, the term first appears in the last entry of December, the last entry of the 12th month of the lunar year 1443. So in our Gregorian calendar, that's really actually probably 1444. But that's where we see the introduction of the term Hanmun. It says, this month, His Highness, Sejong, personally created the 28 letters of the vernacular script, Hanmun. Its letters imitate the old seal and are divided into initial, medial, and terminal sounds. Once one combines them, they form a syllable. All sounds in both Chinese characters and in the rustic language of this country may be written. Although they are simple and fine, they shift and change and function without end. These are called the correct sounds for the instruction of the people. That's the term that you saw, you may remember, Meitsan used. Hanmun, throughout the rest of the remainder of the Shiro, is used 906 times. These are all the different variants for Hanmun. Hanmun, Hanso, Hancai, Hanza, Hanhe, Hangan, Hangyo, Handan, and Tina, which we already discussed. These are various, all of these refer to the written vernacular. We won't discuss what each word means, but they're all references to the written vernacular. Jinso, now, its first appearance in the Shiro is in a 1490 text. And there it says, this is just a small passage from quite a long entry. It says, Chum, so this may be not very understandable, but or difficult to understand without the context. But it says, Chung Yi-sun's testimony was as follows. Su Chun-gun's wife showed me the contents of a letter written in Hanmun. I translated it to Jinso and presented it to the correctional tribunal. And the draft report, which has been presented, is a translation in Hanmun of what was sketched out in Jinso. So again, this may be difficult to understand what exactly is being said there, but the takeaway point is that you'll see here it says Jinso and its variants occur 56 times following this 1490 entry. What you'll notice is two things. One, Jinso is introduced into the official record nearly 50 years after Hanmun. Another thing is that it occurs with the term Hanmun. And if you all but there's 56 times it occurs, all but 4 of those occurrences in the Shiro co-occur with the term Hanmun. So what does this mean? Jinso was a reaction to Hanmun. The term Jinso is a reaction to the term Hanmun. To really not to the term Hanmun, but to the creation of the vernacular script. Jinso. So the aristocracy, the educated elites. Sorry, stay back here. The educated elites, they largely snubbed the written vernacular, and they continued to use Literary Sinitic. It was sort of, it was the center of their literate world. It was the only form of literacy they'd ever known. It was a sign of distinction to learn and to be fluent in Literary Sinitic. So Jinan or Jinso is this reaction by the ruling elite against the creation of the vernacular script. It shows up after the vernacular script. So they didn't refer to Literary Sinitic as Jinso until after the creation of the vernacular script, and it only occurs to distinguish. So it only occurs in entries that are already talking about the vernacular. So, for example, if there's a proclamation that's going to be sent out, the king may say, make sure it's published in Jinso and Hanmun. Or if there's something that was originally in Hanmun and they need to have it translated, to say, we'll take that letter that's in Hanmun and translate it into Jinso. So it's only used as a term of distinction everywhere. That doesn't mean that Literary Sinitic is not referred to in the Shiro other than 54 times. In fact, just the opposite. Literary Sinitic It's the default language. They don't need to refer to it explicitly. It's the default language. Right? They're writing in Literary Sinitic. There's no need to mention the language. If they do mention it, it's simply mun, writing. It's simply mun or cha or muncha, writing or characters. And that means Literary Sinitic. You don't need a special term when you're just talking about Literary Sinitic. Now when you're talking about another language, like say the vernacular, now you need a term to distinguish between the two. Jinso is this sort of a term. It's this term of distinction. To elevate Literary Sinitic above the vernacular, but also as a term of distinction. Of distinguishment, sorry. Now Hanmun, as I said previously, Hanmun occurs first in Korean official writings in the text of the treaty of the Hanmunkwa Treaty, it's called, the treaty between Japan and Korea. It occurred on Hanmunkwa Island, and so it's termed as the Hanmunkwa Treaty. It says in Article 3, it says, henceforth, in official correspondence between our two countries, Japan shall use the writing of that country, that country's language, and an additional copy translated into Hanmun shall be prepared and kept for 10 years. An interesting thing, and Joseon shall use Jinso. Now, the interesting thing is that these are actually referring to the same language. They're using two different terms. And so it may be, and I don't know exactly why, there's two possible explanations, but I'll only talk about one. It may be that Koreans didn't know this term. Now that's unlikely. It would have been obvious just from the characters what it meant. But this term, in fact, had a history, the two characters that make up this term had a history in Korea that was different, referred to something else other than Literary Sinitic. And it's possible that they assumed that the Japanese assumed this was a different, something other than Literary Sinitic. So really, probably a proper translation of this in English should be kanbun, the Japanese term for kanbun instead. Hanmun essentially, I mean, not literally, but in effect, overnight overtakes the use of Jinso. So there's this transformation. But as I said, China is in charge, largely in charge of what's going on in Korea in the 1880s, following the Treaty of Hanwha. And so you have to wonder, well, why, when Literary Sinitic didn't actually change in status in Korea, why did the terms change? If as Mechun says, Hanmun is an otherizing term, why didn't Koreans pick up on that? They didn't immediately transition to using the vernacular, and certainly not in the 1880s when the transition from Jinso to Hanmun, the terms, happens. So why? Well, it's largely because the Chinese were in charge, well, in control. So that's too. Because of Chinese influence in Korea. They weren't in control, they weren't in charge. But because of Chinese influence in Korea, the term gets picked up. And so at first, Hanmun isn't necessarily seen as this otherizing term. Korea at this time, in order to sort of distance itself from Japan, they're coming closer to their Chinese patron and taking on this term as a way of not necessarily otherizing Literary Sinitic, but sort of buddying up to China. And you'll see in the 1883 treaty with Great Britain, there's Article 12 talks about language. It says, our two nations, Korea and England, Great Britain, having negotiated and concluded this treaty in the languages of our respective countries, and it lists what the languages are, Hanmun and English. So here is Korea stating, our language is Hanmun. The language of our nation is Hanmun. Right? In our respective countries' language. Hanmunka, right? Have carefully inspected each version and have confirmed that their phrasing and meaning correspond to one another. Now, you say, well, then this is a declaration by Koreans saying our language is still Hanmun. The terms are different, but it's Hanmun. In fact, it's not the case. The treaty with Great Britain is actually written by a Qing official. It was negotiated in China between an English official, a Great British official. He negotiated it there. He brought it to Korea, had the Koreans read it, and sign it. This was a treaty really between. This was China. This was Qing China trying to distance Korea from Japan. And this occurs several times in later treaties. The Koreans write their later treaties with the other Western nations, and they take this as a model and continue to call Hanmun our nation's language. Okay, so this transition happens from Chinseo to Hanmun, and it happens at a different time than the transition from Onmun, that's for the vernacular, to Kungmun, the state language. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why it's allowed to happen. Okay, so here's an article from a newspaper, 1886. This is the title on education law. It says, "Our country should establish schools and instruct students in Onmun, from the works of Confucius and Mencius to Europeans' works on industrial arts, though these all should be translated into Onmun and memorized. Then, after 10 years of studying, those with no privation at home should be made to study Hanmun as well and become outstanding Confucian scholars. In this way, schools will become universal and moral edification will be fully realized." So what do we see here? Okay, the argument aside, let's just drop that for now. We see Hanmun coexisting with Onmun. So the transition doesn't happen at the same time. And my theory is that if the situation that caused the transition, that ended up causing the transition from Onmun to Kungmun, had occurred when the transition from Chinseo to Hanmun was happening, that transition from Chinseo to Hanmun likely wouldn't have happened, because the Korean scholars at the time, those who were in charge, would have resisted the transition. They would have seen actually Hanmun as an otherizing term, which it becomes by the time Onmun, for the vernacular, becomes the state language Kungmun. So Kungmun, it has this long history in Korea. I said it's this new term, right? Well, it's introduced into the Korean record in 1894 during the Kabul reforms. The two characters that make up the term Kungmun had been around Korea, well, for as long as we can tell. But it meant the language of a particular country or place, and so it needed a qualifier before it. So it meant national, or it meant the language of this place. So you'd have to put this in front of it. So the language of this place, or you'd have to put Japan in front of it. The language of Japan, or our language, you'd have to put our in front of it. Now, after the transition, you can just say Kungmun, and it stands specifically just for the national language. This idea of a national standard language was not something Korea had until the late 19th century. This is something that develops in Europe, begins in Germany, this connection with the nation and language. It goes into Japan, and from Japan into Korea. So we have examples like Kungmun, our country's language. Ki Kungmun, that country's language. We also see examples of Ilbon Kungmun, so the language of Japan, or Choson Kungmun, right? But after the transition in 1894, you no longer need any qualifiers. Kungmun means Kungmun. Kungmun means state, the language of state. This is a different way of conceptualizing what Kungmun means. And we already said that Kungmun could mean, or our nation's language, our nation's writing, could mean Hanmun. We saw the example in the treaty with Japan. The treaty with Great Britain, where it says the language of both our states. It says Yang Kungmun, the two nations' language, written languages. Not by 1894. Kungmun means a standard language. So in the Edict on Public Writing, published in the Kwanbo, the national, the official gazette in 1894, reads, it says, "All laws and edicts shall be based in Kungmun, the national language. One may attach a translation in Hanmun, or mix Kungmun and Hanmun together." Okay? Now, why is this important? Again, because the transition in the two terms, the transition from the transition from Chinseo to Hanmun, and the transition from Onmun to Kungmun, sorry for all these terms, because they happen at separate times, they're allowed to happen. But it puts those who defend Literary Sinitic behind the game. They've lost the term that gives Literary Sinitic its legitimacy. They've lost it. They've stopped using it. It's gone 15, 20 years before the transition to the national script for the vernacular. So it puts them on the defensive, those who would defend it in public. Many just ignored this issue. They did the same thing that happened at the beginning of the vernacular in the 15th century. They just ignored it. Who cares? We're going to continue to write in Literary Sinitic, right? It worked then, you know. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't work into the 19th century. So what happens is those who defend it are far behind the game in defending it. They've lost any ability to really take hold of terms. These terms matter. The terms are charged. I hope you can see that. I hope you can see that the terms matter. They're charged. They mean something. They mean something to those who use them. So we have this. This is what I'll end on. They have this text. This is from a literary journal, and the author, his name is Hyung. He's important in Hanmun studies during this period. He creates some hanmunkwa textbooks. And we talk about hanmunkwa as being teaching Hanmun, right, as part of the new curriculum. He creates hanmunkwa textbooks. He writes on the importance of Hanmun. He's a real Hanmun scholar. He passed the examination before it had been abolished. Before it had been abolished. This guy's really steeped in the use of Literary Sinitic. He says, this is in 1908. He says, in a text, and look what he does. The name of the title of his essay, Non Hanmun Gungmun. On Hanmun and Gungmun, what's the order for him? Hanmun first. Okay. And actually, the responses to this article rip him for that, because right we have Guk Hanmun, or Guk is first. But here he is putting Han in front of the nation, right? He's putting the Chinese in front of the nation. So since being established by Hanmun and Kija, our nation has gone on to use Hanmun for 4,000 years. Hanmun existed at the origin of our nation. It is not something imposed upon us from abroad. Now the world says only after abolishing Hanmun and writing in pure Gungmun can our nation begin to be established. Though reasoning of this nature is absurd and delusional on its face, requiring that nothing further be said, it must be called out. For if it is not, the foolish will in the end be unable to realize it. Sejong first made Gungmun's 36 letters modeled after China's script and called it Hanmun Panjar, Hanmun spelling, so as to assist with Hanmun, simply to teach the dumb masses. That's a nice, the dumb masses who, I didn't realize it sounded like that. When you're writing the stupid people, the illiterate masses who did not understand Hanmun. It was not intended to abolish the one, Hanmun, and replace it with the other. So what do we see here? We see, okay, Hyung is trying to defend Koreans' use of Hanmun. But Jinso is gone. He can't use that term. It's delegitimized. People won't have it. Right? We have Gungmun now. Gungmun, this is 1908, right? So Gungmun has been the national script since 1894, right? So well over a decade, almost a decade and a half. And what does he have to do? He has to argue on his enemy's terms. Literally. Literally. In arguing for the Koreanness of using Hanmun, he has to use this term that means someone else's language. He's lost the fight. He's lost the rhetorical fight. The rug's been taken out from under him with the loss of the term Jinso. He can't win this fight. He can't say, using Hanmun, that this belongs in our country anymore. He can't say that anymore. It's on its face. It doesn't work. He's lost the fight. So this is the implication. Now, of course, in 1910, the rug is pulled out from all of them. There's just large language debate that's going on at this time. This is just one example of the pro Literary Sinitic side. But the rug's taken out from underneath all of them, and Japan becomes in charge of the curriculum. This is how the ideas trickle down to institutionalization. Right? You take the idea, you take you take the proclamation, and you make it now part of the curriculum. And by the time someone actually stands up to those who are willing to stand up for Literary Sinitic do so, they've lost the fight. The fight's over. The words that they would use to wage the fight are taken from them. So this is one aspect of the transition from Literary Sinitic to the vernacular in Late-Choson Korea. And I'll end there and take any questions. There's a question right next to Will. Start with you.
So,
Yes.
could he have used Chinso, where he first uses Hanmun there? Is that what he was talking about?
No. Hanmun, when he says Hanmun, he's referring to the vernacular. The vernacular is now the national script.
Well, right. Okay. So he's calling it Onmun. So
Yeah.
Onmun is.
He's just describing what Sejong, in Sejong's day, right here.
Yeah.
Is this what you're asking about? This term? He's just describing what the term was in Sejong's day. Hanmun.
Was there any part of this that people earlier than him would have recognized as referring to Chinso? Anything in that paragraph there that would have?
Well, yeah, he says Hanmun. Hanmun's the new term for Jinso. Jinso is the authentic real script, right? The authentic real language. That's what Jinso means, right? But that term's been taken away. Now it's Hanmun. It's China's script. Okay. Is that your question? Yes.
So if the battle was lost because the term had changed, was there any effort to change the term back? Have you seen any
Not to change it back to Jinso. See, these people who would be willing to continue to write in Literary Sinitic, it did throughout the colonial period and even beyond. Began to write their anthologies and such in Literary Sinitic. I mean, this is what they were literate in. This is what they knew how to write. They weren't going to relearn literacy. A group of them, including Yeo Gi-hyun, form a sort of this pro-Literary Sinitic group. And they start taking up the term Hanmun. For Asia. For Asia. So it's a script. They want to be still part of this cosmopolitan order, right? They're not as focused on the nation itself necessarily. Korea as an independent nation. The texts they use, the things they've learned, have always tied them to a very cosmopolitan past, where scholars in China, where the ideas that originated in China could be shared with people in Japan, could be shared with people in Korea through a common literacy. And they were not literate in this new vernacular script. So, not to say that it would be inevitable that the vernacular would overtake Literary Sinitic, but it certainly was not inevitable that we have what we have today in Korea. Korea could look a lot more like Japan and have a mixed script. Hanmun, as we talked about, was really a modeling of what the Japanese were doing, where they continued to use Chinese characters both for their original borrowed sense, but also as a rebus, that is, they were used for their meanings and read using their Japanese meanings, rather than read in their pure Sino-Japanese readings. Is that clear? Nick?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, there's a part here that says the new market for literary Sinitic teaching materials calls it this small publishing group.
Yeah.
And there were different opinions, found represented in these textbooks.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, if I were a student, at that time, like, how localized would those differences be? Would they be, like, would my neighbor maybe be learning from some other textbook that?
Okay. So that's a good question. So I talked about the sort of the pro-Literary Sinitic faction. Well, it's not as if all those who believed in the continued use of Literary Sinitic all felt the same way. So some of them taught it differently, and their textbooks reflected differences in the way they thought Literary Sinitic should continue to be used, and how to teach it. Teaching styles changed. So it largely depended on where you went to school. There were largely three sort of institutions for teaching Literary Sinitic. there was the state schools, there were the missionary schools, and there were other private schools. And the private schools sort of each had its own system. It wasn't necessarily an overarching. But the missionary schools largely used the same texts. The state-sponsored schools used the same text. And the private schools largely continued to teach Literary Sinitic as it had always been taught. So, I mean, this continued sort of like the classic curriculum continued to be used, this sort of rote memorization of the Confucian canon. There's this great description of the guy Richard Rutt, writes in the 1960s of, he was an Anglican bishop. He's now a Catholic bishop. He was an Anglican bishop. Oh, he's a Catholic priest. He was an Anglican bishop working here in Korea in the 60s, and one of his fellow bishops that he worked with, a Korean bishop, had been educated. He was born in 1905, so this tells you something about how long. He was born in 1905, but he was educated in the traditional schools. So he wouldn't have come of age to go to school until the colonial period had started. And he's going to a traditional school. So these traditional schools continue. And you can go like down to Andong now and you can see sort of like the vestiges of these traditional schools. But they're not, I mean, they're nothing like they would have been, where they're actually sort of, this is what you need to know to be a successful human being, to be a true Confucian. So it depended where you went to school, really. Yes?
One thing that fascinated me is kind of sociology of dead languages here. The comparison and the contrast, a sharp contrast with the situation in the West with Latin. That by the 1880s, that new knowledge has not been presented in Latin for 250 years.
Yes.
However, the universities continue to teach it. It is the core of the curriculum in recitations that are exactly as mind-numbing as any Confucian-style memorization
Right.
at UConn.
Right.
And it's only changing, ironically, simultaneously with your changes going on with Literary Sinitic.
Well, and there were a great example of sort of the parallel you're talking about. There was so the missionary schools, right? These are people who had to come. If they were taught in the late 1800s in university, they had largely a Latin curriculum, or many of them had a Latin curriculum. And there's there's a man there's a man who's writing a summary of all the different missionary schools and what they're teaching and how they're teaching and why they're teaching classical Chinese, Literary Sinitic. And his defense of their teaching classical Chinese, Literary Sinitic, sorry, his defense of that is the earliest defense in Korea for continuing to teach classical Literary Sinitic in the new curriculum. He says, the students need a grind, right? It's something that sharpens the mind. It's something that makes them a student, right? Sort of rote grind, you know. And he says just like the Western boys need Latin, the Koreans need Literary Sinitic. And there were people who, and you talk about new knowledge not being introduced in Korea or in Latin for 200 years before this transition really happens in universities in Europe. And so that's one of the I talked about the different strains of pro-Literary Sinitic groups. That's sort of the difference. That's some of the different strains. There's the missionary strain, and they have their own purpose, and what they're putting in Literary Sinitic is different. They're translating Western fairy tales. They're translating into Literary Sinitic and teaching Literary Sinitic through, or the Bible, or things like that. The other two strains are the classical strain, just continue doing what it's doing. And Yeogyu Hyung, the guy who wrote this last little bit here, he does that, but he compiles it into a textbook. And the last strain is this strain that says, in order for Literary Sinitic to stay relevant, we have to be publishing new knowledge. We have to be publishing and they use that term, new knowledge and old knowledge. I mean, it's Guha and Shinha. And they say we have to be publishing new knowledge, new essays using Literary Sinitic that talks about the new technologies and whatever that's coming into Korea. And so it is an interesting parallel. There are some significant differences. Unlike Latin, Literary Sinitic was never a spoken language in East Asia, and that makes a big difference in the way that it's used. But good point, Sarah.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
Because I'm interested in, obviously, religion, as you know.
Okay.
I'm wondering about the role of missionaries
Uh-huh.
in either this transition or either the role or influence of missionaries in this transition. And the articles that I've read about this usually refer to hunger, and I'm wondering why you didn't talk about hunger.
Hunger at this point in time would be an anachronistic term. Hunger is hunger. The term hunger comes from and early on hunger would have referred to as much a specific orthography. So when the vernacular language starts to take over, there are competing orthographies because the way that it had been invented, the language had changed. And so they had to change the style of writing, and there were competing styles, orthographies, for the way to use the vernacular script. And Hangul represented a group known as the Hangul Hakwe, headed by Chu Shikyung, Che Hung-bae, and these guys. And Hangul at that time the term Hangul at that time, and this isn't until the 1820s, 1830s that Hangul is introduced. And at that time it would have meant as much, because there are competing orthographies. There's orthographies that are used. Now the missionaries had a big role in this, in the change in different orthographies, because the missionaries in about 1890, they transitioned from using Literary Sinitic in their tracts, because they wanted to, at first when they came, the way they actually came in 1884, was through influence with elites. And they largely proselytized among elites, up until about the early 1890s. They switched to a program of proselytizing to lower classes. And that's when they changed to vernacular tracts. They started translation of the Bible. And there's this big fight about which orthography they're going to use to translate the Bible. Most of the Christians are centered up, well, a large number of the Christians are centered up, Korean Christians are centered up in Pyongyang, and they have a different dialect, and their orthography reflects that different dialect. And so there's this competing dialect, and so I don't use Hangul because it's anachronistic, especially this time. And the same reason why in my own research, I try to avoid the term Hanmun before this period, and just refer to Literary Sinitic.
I have another question.
Okay,
I can ask
sure.
them. So I'm curious, I mean, any research is usually making an intervention of some sort. I'm just wondering who you're arguing against, if anyone, or what kind of intervention you need to make in that in academia.
So am I taking the pro-Literary Sinitic side or the pro-vernacular side, sort of thing?
Or what's kind of the larger implications of your research?
Well, the important thing to note is the ideas. So a lot of this is symbolic early on, as I talked about. A lot of this is ideas. A lot of this was just ideology. It wasn't necessarily in practice. As I said, Koreans, the transition to the vernacular takes much longer than it continues through the colonial period and beyond, really. But during this period is when the ideas that are the ideas Koreans hold today about languages were first articulated during this period. Does that make sense? So, I mean, I am all in favor. Koreans to have mass literacy required moving away from Literary Sinitic. Now, the question of script is a different question, but they needed to write in the vernacular, whether they used a sort of a mixed script system like the Japanese do today, or the pure Hangul. That's a different question. They really did have to move, I think, away from the classical language. That being said, it had its cost. So it's a huge benefit. There was never previously a mass literacy in Korea. What allows for mass literacy is the transition to the vernacular. Okay, and so you can't argue against mass literacy. It's sort of the foundation of democratic participation of all this. But you lose something when when you lose, it's sort of like a gyokpo who loses their parents' language. There's a loss there. Now, so for all of Korea's, even today, even with, now maybe the internet is evening this out, but I would wager that the balance of text, if you had a scale and you could put all that had been written in vernacular by Koreans and all had been written in Literary Sinitic by Koreans, it probably still weighs towards Literary Sinitic. So, I mean, you've got all of that locked behind characters, locked behind this language, that Koreans can only access through translation. Someone else spoon-feeding it to them. Now that has largely always been the case. There's only a select few who had ever been able to access it, right? So it's only a few, the ruling elites have been able to. But there is a loss. So, did I answer your question at all?
I guess that later.
Okay. Yes. In the back.
I just had a question, maybe it's a little bit outside of the scope of this talk, but you talk about language and power, and I was wondering, and in the...
That was my sexying term. Did you miss that part?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the citation that the first citation that you mentioned, use of Chintel 1490, what I thought was really interesting was that in that text it says that it was so-and-so's wife had written this memorial or this thing, this letter in Hanmun, and that it had to get translated to Chintel.
Yes.
And so obviously Hanmun has had for a long time an association with specific genderization.
Hanmun learning, or I'm sorry, yeah, you're right.
A feminized, I'm sorry, let me just...
Oh, go ahead, yes.
A feminized portion to it. And I was wondering what sort of the gender issues, or if there was even kind of this language power, feminine, masculine, gender situation that's happening in the 1880s and the early 20th century.
How does that fit? That's a good question. I don't know the answer completely. If you look at arguments, so there are a couple of different places where the debates happen about whether to continue to use Literary Sinitic or to use the vernacular. They happen in new literary journals that are starting up during the late 1800s. They happen in new in the forwards of different textbooks, whether it be a Hanmun textbook or a Hanmun textbook. They happen in new newspapers and other circulation tracts. They happen in this new medium, the new press that develops, largely after 1894. And the press still is largely Literary Sinitic. They're still largely writing in Literary Sinitic or Hanmun, the mixed script. In those arguments, there's not a lot about the issue of the written vernacular being for women. The statements about, so there was actually a term we talked about, Hanmun. So another term for the vernacular was amgur, women's script, literally, women's letters, amgur. And so, I mean, here's a term, very charged term itself, that sort of feminizes, delegitimizes then the script, right? But that's not a whole large part of the change that happens in the late 1800s. Maybe I'm missing it, but what's been compiled of those arguments, it's not really there. Now there's some interesting stuff I could talk to you about or show you some interesting documents where the Korean elites had this interesting relationship to the vernacular. They oftentimes would teach their boys how to read, make sure their sons knew how to read and write in the vernacular. They, of course, would interact with women, with their wives or their concubines in letters with the vernacular, so they themselves had to understand how to write it. Anyway, there's a number of things that early on, there's sort of begrudged respect for its use. But as far as sort of the discourse surrounding it, it's very feminized. Vernacular is for women and Buddhists. Which may as well be as good as women to them. I mean, I say that, that's what they would say, not me. Anyway, okay, I'm told I need to stop, but I'd be happy to, I've been told a couple times, but I'd be happy to take any other questions later, and thanks for